Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to all of you for being here. This has been a really difficult time for our country, and we want to find solutions to make it better. Mr. Callio, I'd like to start with you. The CARES Act provided a rather considerable amount of funding for airlines in the form of loans, loan guarantees, and cash assistance. But the CARES Act also authorizes the U.S. Department of Transportation to require that air carriers maintain scheduled flights that were in place prior to March 1st, 2020. Given the drop in passengers that we've experienced due to travel restrictions and other government-imposed mandates, does the requirement that you have to maintain air service at pre-COVID-19 levels and based on pre-COVID-19 flights, does that make sense? And does it allow the airline industry to restructure and do what else it needs to do in order to respond?
Thank you, Senator. That's a very good question. First of all, we would like to commend Secretary Chow and her staff. They have been wonderful partners both in the passage of the Act and trying to work with us on the essential air service. It is part of the CARES Act. It is causing an awful lot of planes to be flown with no passengers, 1 passenger, 5 passengers. That does not help any kind of liquidity problems and our employees in the long run. If there could, the law also says it should be reasonable and practicable in terms of the continuation of service. We hope for a closer look and a rationalization at the reasonable and practicable language, both on behalf of our crews and the industry. It doesn't make sense when you've got multiple carriers flying multiple sites, multiple flights, into places where there is no demand.
Right. So in other words, if you've got flights that are continuing to take off, especially if those are redundant of other flights, either from the same carrier or another one, and these multiple flights are each operating with no passengers or with very, very few passengers, in the end, tell me how that harms the consumer of airline services, of airline tickets.
It harms the consumer because the recovery will be longer. The chance of keeping the most employees on board will be undermined. And if you want to look at it from an environmental point of view, we shouldn't be flying airplanes that are empty.
Sure. When we look at it from a taxpayer standpoint, we've set aside a certain amount of money to help with this crisis. Wouldn't those same dollars go a lot farther if we allowed additional flexibility for airlines to take into account flights as to which there's no demand?
Yes, sir, they would.
I think there is something of a false argument that the aviation industry cares nothing about health and safety of its customers or of its employees. And that, of course, ignores a fundamental truth that unhealthy customers and employees mean that you go out of business. I mean, it stands to reason that if you mistreat those who are your customers or your employees, either one of them, especially both of them, it's not going to be good for business. Am I out on a limb here, or does this reflect what you see within the industry?
No, Senator, we do not see you out on a limb. We make the case all the time. Passengers and shippers have been voting with their feet, so to speak. 2.5 million passengers a day. So I always tell the story. I grew up I was born in the 1950s in Cleveland, Ohio. Where I grew up, nobody was able to get on an airplane, ever. The first time I flew was when I was being recruited for a sport in college. And I flew 2 times after that until I graduated law school because we couldn't afford it. It's been more accessible and more affordable. And the Deregulation Act has helped. And we care deeply about our customers. The level of satisfaction last year was the highest ever by the J.D. Power study, not something that we produced. So there's 2 sides of this equation, and somewhere the facts bear out about our customers and our employees.
And last I checked, the airline industry is still heavily regulated.
Yes,
not in the same way that it was prior to deregulation, when, as you pointed out, air travel was unaffordable for nearly all Americans. But it's still heavily regulated, right?
I think, if I recall correctly, 13 agencies, 20,000 regulations.
Yes. And so if we were to add to those regulations right now, if we were to compound the regulatory compliance costs, what does that do to the affordability of air travel?
it decreases the affordability and increases the price.
And in the end, what impact would that have on the health of the American people if they can't travel?
I think the American people would be disappointed. Many people get angry if, a flight's late or something like that happens. But you take big machines, you take weather, things happen. And there are mechanical delays, and we won't put a flight in the air if it's not safe for our passengers or our crew. And personally, I believe that people have taken flying for granted for some time. It still thrills me every time I get on an airplane because maybe, growing up I couldn't do it. But I think it's going to be a real change in the American people's lives and our customers' lives with the restrictions that are in place now on air travel just out of necessity because of this pandemic and because of what's going to happen in terms of demand and potentially cost later.
One day I look forward to having other conversations under more favorable circumstances on ways that we can diminish unnecessary talking on the public address system by flight attendants, the use of unnecessary terms like "at this time," and the vain repetition of the same warnings over and over again. But for now, we're going to have to leave it at that, given that I'm out of time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator.
Senator Lee, do you think, how would we get around the antitrust problems in doing what you suggested? I think all of us would be happy to find a way not to have empty planes.
Oh, yeah.
Lying abandoned routes.
I was hoping you were talking about the unnecessary talking by flight attendants on the public address system. There is a complicated relationship between regulated industries and competition. In the railroad industry, you've got an excessive, elaborate system of regulations that inhibits competition, but you've got corresponding exemptions from a number of otherwise applicable antitrust laws. The same thing could be a model for this industry. Now, I'm not suggesting that anyone ought to simply shut down their flights, but what I am saying is that there ought not be artificial constraints by which we require an airline to continue operating air service for which there is no demand. There needs to be some flexibility on the part of the airlines, because if there is not, we're going to burn through that money that much more quickly, and we're going to make air travel that much less affordable.
Surely we can think that through.